So I'm Brian Fisher, I'm a GP. I've been a GP in South East London since 1976, and I was a full-time GP based in Sydenham, and then I retired, and now I do much less general practice over the last 13 years or so, but still in South East London, in New Cross. Well, I grew up in West London, and I'd always wanted to be a deep sea diver, then an astronaut, and then when I was about 7 I always wanted to be a doctor, so it kind of happened that way. I was very lucky, and so I headed into medical school and moved to South East London when I got you get to train to be a GP. You need a year in a general practice to learn the ropes and to understand, consultation and understanding people. So I had that. I was fortunate to have that in a fantastic practice in the Elephant and Castle, and then I kind of stayed in South East London. The other link was that when I started in my first practice, which was in Peckham, I found that there was a strange thing called a community development hub, a little way from the health centre where I was. So that sparked off a whole set of interest in community development, which has never left me. So I've been interested in that for a long time. One of the things I've been trying to do for a long time, ever since then, really, is to persuade a government that community development is something that ought to be available across the NHS and linked up with local authorities. I haven't got very far with that. It's not a very successful campaign, but that's something I've been very interested in. Yeah, so I think it's a long time ago now. So I'm not sure that I've got all the details right, but my recollection is that I and a few other people had been very concerned about the threats to the NHS and the cuts and the increasing privatisation of the NHS. So I and another couple of people set up an organisation called SOS NHS, I think. And that probably was a little while before the threat to Lewisham Hospital thing, really. We were just beginning to get operational, and then the threat to Lewisham, the very clear physical threat to Lewisham Hospital, became obvious, and we kind of merged into the Save Lewisham Hospital Campaign. It was obviously the same kind of thing, and we were local people, so it made absolute sense to kind of for us to be absorbed in this bigger and more precise campaign, which was about Lewisham. So I guess I was involved right from the start. The SOS NHS campaign was probably half a dozen people, I suppose, and I think the first, beginnings of the Lewisham campaign, because there was an organisation, I don't know if it's still around, I haven't heard about it for ages, called 36 Degrees, and that was a big national sort of campaigning organisation, and that helped to gather, to help us organise the initial meetings. So the initial meetings had quite a few people in it, 30 people, 40 people, I guess. They met in the Waldron Health Centre, which is in New Cross, which has a nice meeting room. One of the doctors, Dr. Irvin, was a GP there, so it was relatively easy for her to get this space. There was a great deal of enthusiasm, and my involvement, I can't remember really what I did particularly early on, but when it became obvious that one of the things we were going to do was to ask for a judicial review, I began to write a document that sort of summarised why we needed a judicial review and what the kind of basis of that might be. And my recollection is that I brought various people together. We put the stuff that I'd written on the screen, and people commented on it. And one of the things that I thought would be very helpful for us was that the Jeremy Hunt had set out, or somebody had set out. There was a set of criteria really across the NHS, which made it clear that changes did need local agreement. There were sort of three or four key things, and I can't remember what they all were. But anyway, they all played into our hands, that the CCG had to agree, local people had to agree, as I recall. And it seemed to me that those would be a good basis for a judicial review. And when the lawyers got involved, that is the kind of basis on which we fought the judicial review. What was pretty amazing, really, about the early stages was the way everybody pulled together, and the way there were some pretty imaginative, like the Buggy Army. There were lots of other, we held hands around Lewisham Hospital. The whole thing was a very clever. I mean, none of those were my ideas. They were very exciting process, really, where people accumulated ideas and they were just very nicely put together, and everybody was very committed to making a difference. So there was huge voluntary activity, and it really, pulled hundreds of people, eventually in the march, thousands of people together, all with a very strong ethos about preserving the NHS as a whole and preserving Lewisham Hospital specifically, and it managed to bring in the staff members and MPs, and it was a very comprehensive and coherent campaign, which I think, Keep Our NHS Public was a very key intellectual and sort of ideological support, really. It was very helpful indeed. So I did bits and pieces. I remember I appeared there was a sort of People's Inquiry that was organised, which was sort of officially run by Michael Mansfield, QC, and there were lots of people giving evidence, so I gave evidence to that from a GP perspective. So it was a very supportive and encouraging process, and my interest in community development was sort of encouraged by all of this, because one of the things that I think is most important is that we support and encourage the development of a kind of participatory democracy. So there's formal democracy where you vote on, you have councillors and you vote for MPs, and all of that's very formal. But there's also another layer, which is a participatory democracy, and I've always been interested that community development could support that, and I think the campaign was one fantastic example of ways in which people got together, took control over their own area, and made a huge difference to the outcome. So it was an honour to be part of it, a privilege and an honour to be part of the process and my recollection of the actual judicial review sessions, and I'm not a lawyer, I know nothing about it, but the first session, the judge kind of set out the scene, really, and one of the issues was whether to what extent the Secretary of State had the power to do this. And as I said, we were arguing that he couldn't do it unless there was local involvement. And the phraseology of these 3 or 4 specific criteria that local change had to meet, the judge said, I think this revolves around the word "with" or something. The meaning of this particular word, if we can get to the bottom of that, I think that kind of we will be able to unravel the legality of this process. It was very I would never have thought of it that way. But that is indeed, I think, how the argument transpired, whether they had the power over or the power with, or what the word with meant, something like that. I may have got the details wrong, but so from a legal point of view, it centred in a very odd way around the meaning of a single word, apparently. Anyway, we won, and that was great, and made a huge difference. So I found it quite frightening, the idea of setting up a judicial review, because we had to pay the lawyers if we failed. And I think I was the most of anybody concerned about how we would raise the money. But actually, we raised the money really easily. But I was worried that if we went ahead with this judicial review, that if we lost, then we'd be landed with this. I remember being much more frightened about it than other people. So yeah, you have to be fairly up with the documents and what the local managerial people were deciding about it. So I think a large number of people were clinicians or professionals, NHS people employed by the NHS. So yeah, I think there was a large proportion of those, but that shifted. There were lots and lots of people who got involved and who had to learn really a lot about the way the NHS functioned, what was happening to privatisation and what was happening in the legal changes around the 2012 Act and so on. That was, I can't remember quite the timing, but one of the things that the SOS NHS group was trying to do was to challenge this act, which I think I've got the timing right, which was a big step in privatising the NHS. So I think the main issue that we were concerned about was that every single time the NHS commissioned a service, so they said, the contract for orthopaedics is running out, we need to re-contract for orthopaedics. Every time something like that happened, they would have to go to the private sector to look for somebody who would. It wouldn't necessarily go to the private sector, but it had to be spread out. Could go across Europe as a contracting option, and somebody from anywhere could come in and offer this service from the private sector, as well as the NHS competing for it. And we were everyone was very, very concerned about that. So I think we spent quite a lot of time talking to Lords and MPs about this. And that was the kind of background, I think, to how this all happened at Lewisham. It was a different issue because Lewisham wasn't particularly about privatisation. It was about cutting. But, that the sort of privatisation process was in the background. And of course, all our critiques of that act were played out very quickly. We were completely right. It really did mess up the way the NHS worked. And, many years later, the NHS went out of its way to kind of unravel all of that because it was so time wasting and money wasting. Anyway, so that wasn't directly to do with Lewisham, but it was part of the political background that this happened in.
The irony of conducting these interviews while there's strikes at the moment today.
Sure.
is foremost. Yes.
Yes, I was on the nurses' picket line this morning.
Right.
And we were various people. Obviously, there were almost more press than there were nurses on the picket line, actually, for a while. So anyway, they wanted to interview anybody they could find. So one of them asked me, has the NHS ever been as bad as it is now? And I said yes, sort of at the end of the last Tory administration before Labour got in, before Blair got in. It was absolutely appalling. So there were, routinely 2-year waits for cardiology, and people would die on the waiting list. A lot of deaths waiting for operations. So it has been like this before, and of course the picture is that that's what happens under a Tory administration. And you can see that if you do put money in and respect and consideration and thought for how you make this all work, it's possible to turn it around. And obviously I hope that Labour will be in a position to do that after the next election. But so there is a solution. It doesn't have to be like this. I think the march was the most fantastic. It was organised like a military operation. There were, everyone was given their tasks, and it was pretty amazing, really. The weather was good, and people were out there in their thousands, and it was tremendously inspiring. So I think that was the highlight. The current campaign, we continue to be, a local group who has, lots to say about local services and national things, national services, national issues. So we're supporting the strikes and doing all sorts of things. But I've no idea really whether, that has an impact on Lewisham as a whole. I don't really know. But people will certainly remember and feel proud that we managed, between all of us, between the 20,000 people or whoever it was, whatever it was, that between us we managed to make such a significant difference. That was one of the clever interventions, was that we showed that it wasn't possible to get to the A&E. If the Lewisham A&E had closed, that it was actually very difficult to get to the one that would be open in time. So we actually took public transport and videoed the process, and it was very clear. So it was very, there were some very intriguing ideas that people put together. It was very effective.
And as a GP, I mean, did you feel like, in terms of like Lewisham's families and their ongoing struggle with services, and does a lot of that come through to you as a GP?
Yes, it does, and there was, also some selfish elements. If A&E disappeared, I would have to send people a long way away, and that would impact my patients very dramatically. So I was very concerned. I was concerned about my clinical practice if the A&E that had shut, and then obviously the concern was that would have knock-on effect, and Lewisham as a whole would shut. So that would really make life difficult for me personally and the patients that I served in Sydenham. So it was a big, absolutely essential part of the clinical structure around. It would have been very difficult. And of course the same is happening now. So, I was speaking to somebody, a mother with a 6-year-old on Tuesday, who the child was ill, the temperature and feeling, anyway, it was an ill child, took the child to Lewisham Paediatric A&E, and was so full that there were hours and hours of wait, and kids were sleeping on the floor, and it was absolute kind of chaos there apparently. So she left and went to a urgent care centre, and I spoke to her on the phone when she was waiting outside this urgent care centre in the cold. So that's Tuesday night. It was very minus temperatures, and they wouldn't let her in. They couldn't guarantee that they would see her either. In the end, it turns out, because I phoned her to find out how things had gone the next day, and anyway, they did let her in. She waited for 9 hours before she was seen. I mean, you can't run a service like this anymore. The Tories have just run this thing down. Yeah. So I don't know whether they're running it down deliberately, and they will then say, you can't fund the NHS like this. It obviously doesn't work, so we have to go for a private arrangement like the US or like Europe. And I said this to reporter today who was a health reporter, and he said, I don't think that this is deliberate. They're not clever enough to do this long-term project of running down the NHS and then transferring it to some other payment process. So they're too incompetent to do that. So I don't know whether it's a deliberate process. Anyway, they have threatened millions of people's lives, and it is a very serious, desperate state of affairs. And my patients are suffering.
Mm.